Okay, there's a pile of those. I just wanted you to see what was going on. Then we drafted the argument outlines. We took those whiteboards. And the reason why I photographed them was not for this presentation. It was so that I could make sure the person who was drafting it could remember what happened in the group. And we translated that into presentations for our board members. Our board members get detailed pre-hearing briefings so they understand more about the project. Well, those structured arguments that we took turned out to be a very good guide to building a presentation. So we built a presentation right off of them, using them as the format. Tremendously helpful because we had something to start preparing. And we got into detail on each premise and why we thought that, and what evidence suggested the other side. And tried to make sure that they could see a balanced version, but that the weight of the evidence was apparent at that point. Our lawyer loved this. Why? Because marching into the hearing, I was able to take a draft argument on caribou, and another one on water, another one on social impacts, another one on climate change. Put them in a binder and hand them to them. Here, this is where we think we're going. Right? We think this is where we're trying to get to, unless we hear something quite different. And what we were able to do between the staff and legal counsel is having those arguments before the hearing meant we could identify the information that was missing. Where are the gaps in our voyage? What we think is the map, where be the dragons? You know, the old maps used to have here be dragons on the side of it, right? And you know, where are those areas? And then we could ask for it during the hearing, during cross-examinations, right? Or we could test our if we have premises that were important and we weren't sure if they were right, or they seemed to be right, but we wanted to change the confidence, we test for those during cross-examination, using the structured arguments, the organized reasoning, as the basis. So then we hold a hearing, our board members are here, our staff members are here, and we ask these things during the hearing, and we got very useful answers to us.
One question maybe, how to choose participants in the hearing?
The participants in a hearing, in our case, it's a little bit of a digression. Would it be okay if I come back to that afterward?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. It's a public hearing. Anyone who wants to come is allowed to come. But if you remember to ask afterward, I'll give you a detailed answer. But I don't want to lose the thread of the organized reasoning. So then it came time for the board decision. Based on the presentations they've heard, which were 3 days of elaborate presentations that unfolded the arguments we had and showed the evidence on the record, and based on what they heard in the hearing and the rest of the written record, our board deliberated and made certain decisions, and we had to revise our arguments because we had these arguments, but the board's arguments are what matter. And if the board feels differently, obviously we work for them and our arguments have to represent their reasoning. And so, you know, there was some updating of what we said based on board feedback, as there should be. And then we got to the biggest part at the tail end of our EA report writing. So we had these revised arguments, and we used that almost as a table of contents for our report. Right? We took these revised arguments and said, this is what we need to say. This is most of our report right there. And we used that for writing the report. There are some huge advantages for having these argument outlines before you do the writing. One big advantage is it's easier to edit individual sections. So some of our environmental assessment officers had only been with us 1 or 2 years. They have not written a major report of environmental assessment before. Remember, this report has to be legally bulletproof, logically sound, scientifically rigorous, and clear to people without technical backgrounds. It's not that easy. But what used to happen is, as a manager, I would have to, they start writing, and I just wait to see what they produce, and then I get 50 pages on caribou, and I look and go, well, you can't get there from here. I don't know what this is, why is it? But in this case, I started with the argument outline. I knew they were going to give the following argument, premise A, B, C, and therefore D, which means that I had a map of where they were going, and where they were not filling that map in clearly, I could work as they did. I didn't need to wait to the end to find out the punchline. I could edit as they wrote, and we could do a more iterative thing, and it was more strategic because it was going towards a specific conclusion based on what the evidence screamed to us, what it showed clearly. As well, quite usefully, we found it much easier to manage the drafting of this larger report. I found it much easier, so did my executive director. Because you could see, based on the outlines, where overlaps are, that interdisciplinary stuff I talked about. You could see the structure and where different sections fit together, you know, in the way that the real world does. So we produced the report. It was about 350 pages. We could have done it faster if it was 500 pages, but we wanted to make it concise and clear. We use organized reasoning in the report in several ways. The most useful thing, I think, is at the beginning of each chapter, right at the top, we put an argument summary. So people who open the chapter on water know exactly where the water argument is going. We say, here's our conclusion, and look, here's why, A, B, C, D. And let's see what we got here. In the summary, I said A, B, C, D, the reasons why. A has a little footnote. And if you open footnote A, it takes you to a whole section with all the evidence for that premise. And B has a little footnote on the same page, and it's all hot linked throughout the document. So you see a structured argument and a conclusion, and you can unpack any one premise and see exactly where the evidence came from. It's transparent, it came from a fair process, it is credible. You can see how the argument was tested, who agreed and disagreed, on what basis, in the individual sections. So that summary at the top was actually like a navigational shortcut throughout the whole section. And we use plain language versions, particularly in our front-end summary, even more plain language than our normal plain language. In the executive summary and in the conclusions, because those were very easy to write because we already had concentrated versions of each section. Very different from what we normally do. Normally we write each section front to end, and then we go back and try to figure out how to dehydrate it, or how to break it down anyway. And this worked much better for us. So here's some examples. Don't bother reading all the small print. I don't put small print if I think people need to read it. Okay? But I wanted you to see some points about this. And now, I've been trusted with a laser pointer. Okay, so I'm just going to point out the main argument points here. In the opinion, here's our conclusion. There are several reasons which are described further. So I talk about the reasons for the conclusion right at the very front of the caribou section. Reason 1, important caribou migration area. Reason 2, cumulative impacts already significant. Reason 3, there are physical barriers this will create. Number 4, no management plan. And number 5, changes to caribou are already affecting Aboriginal communities in an adverse way. So you can see how these go together. But look, this is a footnote that somewhere down here, you click on, you immediately go to a section that talks entirely about why this is true and what evidence suggested it wasn't and why we weighted the evidence the way the board did. Another example, some cultural stuff, right? Exact same deal. This is at the beginning of the whole cultural section, and we find X. So it starts with the conclusion. The reasons supporting it are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And the magic footnotes. So that system worked really well for us. It made a really structured, organized document. It made the document easier to write, and it made it easier to manage the writing. Here's the third example. I just changed the font. But it's basically the same deal. There's a conclusion, premise, premise. As well, we used subject headings where we could that were not just caribou, or not just commitments by developer, not just management plan. We use subject headings that made an assertion. They are in themselves intermediate conclusions because they came from something else. They came from the stuff below them, which means you could look at the table of contents for some sections. For other sections, there were reasons why it was a little complicated to do that. They have to do with legal process and whatever. But this is an example. This is straight from our table of contents. And I think this part's quite well done, and that's why I chose it as an example here. Right? So we have conclusions. It's not just movement corridor, but we say, look, this project's in a movement corridor. The herd is vulnerable. You could read this as an argument. Right? Now, it's important for a board like ours to be sure it doesn't come across as biased, that this is a weighting of fairly gathered evidence. But the point is that if you read section 644, you know where it's going because we've told you where it's going. in the heading. Some of the results of using this overall in the report of EA, in terms of the drafting, are that we had complex arguments. You saw the whiteboards. They look like spaghetti in some cases. Reasonable spaghetti, but spaghetti all the same. Right? The parties could follow the complex arguments. Why? Because they had this map. Right? They weren't pulling a Franklin. Right? They weren't lost at sea in this. They could see where we were going. And parties, including Aboriginal, Indigenous parties from small communities with little educational background, they may have a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, but they don't have a lot of scientists working there or anything. They could follow it no problem. Now, we use more than science. We use Indigenous knowledge on par with science. But that's a different presentation. But the point is that parties, people with an outcome who have skin in the game, as we say, is the football metaphor. Sorry, soccer for no football for you guys, soccer. Anyway, parties could follow it. The ones who have a stake and who are potentially affected by the project could understand the reasoning that got them there. It was clear how their evidence led to the conclusion. It's not like we just say we got a pile of evidence and we think this. You could follow the bouncing ball. Quite a plus for me is, and for my executive director, is we had these things, media interviews were much easier. Because the media are going to ask, why did you possibly find X for Caribou? I don't need to leaf through the report to figure it out. I have 4 very specific, clear reasons that I can point to. Now, we observed that even though some parties did not agree with our conclusion, they respected our conclusion because they saw and respected the process we used to get there. They saw the evidence was collected in a fair and transparent way, and they saw the reasoning that the board used. And they may have chosen differently because of different values about different things, but there was no judicial review, which is very helpful for a board like ours. And by our standards, the minister approved this one quite quickly. For a very large project, complicated assessment report, we noticed that the minister signed off on it, which means everything we wrote became legally binding, and it was a pretty quick and efficient turnover. You guys, as potential proponents, probably are interested in that kind of thing. Right? So there's that. Interestingly, one of the tests that a superior court will use in Canada is the decision reasonable? Well, no one's going to challenge us on reasonability when we put the reasoning right there, organized right in front of their faces. Right? It's not that there was a review and we won, it's that no one took it to a review. And there may be other reasons too, but we observed that that was the case for this. So conclusions overall, this is my last slide, and no more music. I think that organizing we always have reasoning in our reports, but by organizing it and making it evident and bringing it out and putting a bright light on it, we think it helped with the group collaboration during the impact analysis, those whiteboards, the interdisciplinary good stuff that strengthened it. It definitely helped as a tool to build our presentations for the board in the pre-hearing briefing, so we have a better informed board. That should lead to better decisions, and it helped our council get up to speed faster. It helped us ask very useful questions in cross-examination, because we asked questions about the gaps in our arguments, and we could focus and be more strategic about that. It helped with report drafting, the way that we put these pieces together, and the structure of the report. It was a clear structure that people could follow. Remember, I'm talking about cross-linkages back to raw evidence, into premises, straight to a conclusion, right up front. I believe it helped a lot with the clarity and the obvious fairness of our report. When parties who have been involved can better understand how their evidence was considered, that's a more fair report and better acceptance by parties. I am quite convinced that we will be using this approach of working hard to organize our reasoning and using that as a tool for structuring our reports and parts of our process in the future. This presentation will get longer when I've done it from the beginning of an environmental assessment. We only had the value of Glenn's teachings, 2/3 of the way through. Right? If you want to see the report, I've just included something here so that you can find it. Right? It's easy enough. Something that I really just want to leave you with is the idea that by organizing our reasoning, our report worked like a chart, and it guided the environmental assessment participants and the decision makers confidently through the complex waters of impact determinations. So I'm pleased to report this was done with no scurvy whatsoever.